Welcome to There is a Method to the Madness. My name is Rob Maxwell and I'm an exercise physiologist. I'm the owner of Maxwell's Fitness Programs and I've been in business since 1994. Today's episode is muscles. I think you're going to enjoy it. I know I love talking about muscles. Before we get into that, I want to thank our sponsors, our very first sponsors, because we have two now. Jonathan and Lynn Gildon at the Gildon Group at Realty Pros. They currently have over 270 five-star reviews on Zillow. And look, they're just the best at what they do. They hustle, they work together. They're a great team. If you call one, they're going to be helping you. And they've got a team of tons of people to get out there and hustle for you, because that's really what you need. So if you're looking to buy, looking to sell, please give them a shout. They can be reached at 386-451-2412 or at thegildongroup.com. All right, muscles. I believe every personal trainer, physiologist, whoever works with people needs to really understand the muscles. And quite often I'm astonished at how many trainers seemingly don't. And, I know this by listening to what they say sometimes on social media, or if I talk to them, if I, run into them or hear what they tell their clients or whatever. I'm just astonished that it's not as well known, that muscles aren't as well known as they really, really should be. And, they should be. I mean, I know, oftentimes we say, oh, don't should all over people. What are things that we should do? Well, those are things that they really should know. Muscles, every trainer should know. And knowing the muscles just makes the job so much easier, because it makes decisions so much easier. And we have to remember that when we go to the gym to strength train, that's what we're doing. We're strength training. We should be getting stronger. And if we understood what muscles need to be strengthened the most, especially in our unique situations, then we would have a better idea of what exercises to choose. All right. So if you get on your social media and you're watching Instagram and you're seeing people do cool workouts and you think, oh, I want to do that, and maybe you do, maybe that's fun, maybe that's something different, maybe that's a challenge that you've never tried before. That's all well and good, but do you need it? Number one, are they doing more of a cardio exercise, like something fast and explosive to get the heart rate up? Well, that's not strength training anyway. And number two, if they're doing a pretty cool strength training exercise, is that something that you specifically need to be doing? Are you already covering those muscles? Well, if you knew your muscles, then you would better be able to answer that. So that's why this is important, not only for the trainer, but for the trainee. So let's start. I'm going to start with the largest muscle groups and work from there. All right. The biggest muscle groups in the body are the glutes. And I say are, not is, because the glutes actually are three different muscle groups. You have the glute maximus, the glute medius, and the glute minimus. Now, the glute maximus is the big boy. All right. That's the one the ladies want. That's the one some guys want. I mean, that's whatever gender wants what, but if you want a big butt, that's the one. It's the glute maximus. It is responsible for hip extension. So when I said I'm going to go into the muscles, I'm going to teach you what they do. Hip extension. That means if your femur, your thigh, is out in front of you and you pull it back behind you, that is hip extension. That is what glute maximus is responsible for. So when you're thinking walking or running, once your foot hits the pavement and it starts pulling your body through, that is essentially what a hip extension is. Now, if you work all the way back behind you, that is hip hyperextension. So when you see sometimes people doing glute exercises, well, they're training them right by pushing their foot back behind their body. They're doing a form of hip extension. The glute medius is such an important muscle. It is on the side of your hip. It's small. It's not as big as the glute maximus. Collectively, the glutes are huge. Glute maximus by itself is huge. The glute medius is a big not a big muscle group, but a very important muscle group. It sits basically on the side, right by the greater trochanter, which is a interesting little term where if you pushed your finger into your hip, feels like almost a little socket there. That's where that area is. Now, it is responsible for hip abduction. That means like when you walk sideways, you're doing the tube walks, or you're doing the abductor machine. The women like to do, the men should do. It's a very important exercise for stability, but that's the motion that it does. Very important for the muscles, very important for you, because it's a stability exercise. Studies have shown that if we train the glute medius, we're less likely to get knee injuries. So the people I train for improving their coming off of rehab, such as one of our sponsors, Jonathan Gildon, I worked with on his knee, and he's doing very, very well. They might wonder, why are we doing so many hip out exercises? Why are we doing tube walks and abduction? That's why. Because stability of the hip leads to a better knee. Next, you have your glute minimus. So remember, you have three. The glute minimus is responsible for external rotation of the hip. That basically means that if you're sitting on your back and you're rotating your foot outward, that's external rotation of the hip. It also does internal rotation of the hip. So if you're bringing your toe inward, that's internal rotation of the hip. If you are pushing your toe outward, that's external. Glute minimus does both. Stability, really, it doesn't come into play in any kind of active motion, but it's more of a stability muscle group. I wouldn't say you necessarily have to go out of your way to train it unless you're having hip issues. Next, we have the big boy quads, the old quads. I mean, it's, kind of a funny joke. We say, why do we call it quads? Thankfully, 99 people out of 100 guessed correctly that there's four muscles. Yes, they are the rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedialis, and vastus medialis. Four of them are the quads. Now, the rectus femoris is a quad that also acts as a hip flexor. So there you go. All right. The quads extend the knee. That's what they do. So they move your tibia and fibula upward from the knee position. So they extend that portion of your leg. They extend your lower leg. They extend the knee. That's what the quads do. Very, very important. The basic exercise, the primary exercise that you would do, and let me back up and state primary means isolation way to train a muscle group, and compound means doing it more when you're training other muscle groups at the same time. The best primary exercise to train your quads is the leg extension. The best compound exercise to train your quads is the squat. All right. Next, we have the old hamstrings. They're on the posterior portion of your body. They are between your knee and your hip on the back side of your body. And the hamstrings are actually a little bit more than we think. They're not just hamstrings, one muscle. They're the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, biceps femoris long head, biceps femoris short head. So like I said, I love muscles. I know muscles. I think we all should have this kind of knowledge of muscles that I have. And I'm happy to say that Ellen, who works with me here, has the same knowledge of the muscles. Okay, they are responsible for flexion of the knee. Flexion of the knee. So they pull your heel back towards your buttocks. That's what the hamstrings are responsible for. They also work a little bit in hip extension, which is, if you remember, the same exercise or the same movement that your glute maximus does. So that's why when you kind of work your leg curls or do glute exercises, you'll feel your hamstrings and vice versa, because they kind of work together. And we put those two together and we call them the posterior chain of the body. Posterior chain. Very important to have strong glutes. Hamstrings, most people neglect them. They're not in the mirror. They're not mirror muscles. They're not quads, so you can't see them. So we tend to avoid them, but man, they're important. I would argue they're the most important, more important than training those quads, which get a ton of work and everything that you do all the time. All right. How we doing so far? Wish it was kind of a live show so people could ask questions and I can know if we're comprehending or not, so we can't. All right, again, I'm going largest to smallest. Next, I'm going to move to the upper body and talk about the pecs. So you got your pectoralis major. That's one of the largest muscle groups of your upper body, along with your latissimus dorsi. But your pec major, I think we all know where it is. It's the chest muscle, and it's very, very strong. It's very, very important to train. It is responsible for horizontal shoulder adduction. Horizontal because basically due to gravity, you're on your back when you're moving the load. Now that changes a little bit based on machines because the machines are putting you in a different gravity position. And I don't want to, go off on the physics of all that because we can get lost in that all day, although it is very important. But basically that's why it's called horizontal, because essentially you should be on your back when you're facing the load of what you're facing. So an example would be a bench press or a dumbbell fly, which of course you are supine or on your back. So it's responsible for shoulder adduction in that horizontal position, which means it's moving your arm towards your body. That's what it means, all right? Very, very important. It sounds so simple. It's not. I mean, essentially the pec major is responsible for the major pushing exercises, because whenever you're pushing and you need to push as hard as you can, you're going to flare your elbows out, right? You're not going to keep them in. You're going to flare them out so you can get the most leverage. Well, once you flare them out and then the humerus, which is the bone of the upper arm, comes inward, that's called adduction, and that's what the pecs are responsible for. The primary exercise for the pec major is the fly, and the best compound exercise you can do for the pec major is either a bench press, an incline press, or a chest press on the machine. If you don't have any of those, then push-ups. All right, now we move on to the latissimus dorsi, the second largest muscle group of the upper body. It kind of is so close to the pec major that you'd almost call them twins, but it's slightly smaller. So the lats are the upper back to the side, kind of in your armpit, and they actually flail all the way back to your spinal erectors, which is close to your spine. They work in with the rhomboids, which are part of your mid-back, so they're all connected to each other. But the lats are a super important exercise, and they are responsible for two things. They have multifunctions. They're responsible for shoulder adduction. That means if your arm is over your head, they're responsible for pulling your humerus, your upper arm, to your side. And they're responsible for shoulder extension, which means if your arm is upward overhead in front of you and you're pulling it down to your body or pulling a load down to your body, they do that. So they do both. Essentially, they're very similar motions, and you'll find it interesting when I hit on this in a second as to why chin-ups and pull-ups are slightly different, and I'll get into that in 1 second. First off, the primary way to train the lats gets ignored all the time. The only way to isolate the lats is to do a pull-over exercise. Compound exercises, there are many. You can do pull-ups, you can do chin-ups, you can do pull-downs, and you can do rows. Again, when you do those muscles, you're also working the rhomboids too. Now here's something interesting about chin-ups and pull-ups. Pull-ups is typically the hand is overhand position, overhand, and slightly wider usually. It doesn't have to be, but overhand position. So when you're doing that and pulling up, when you think about it, your humerus is actually pulling towards your side, right? So that shoulder adduction still works the lats. When you're doing a chin up, your arms are more to the front and you're holding an underhand grip and you're pulling yourself up. Well, now you're pulling your humerus in front of you to your body, which is, as you remember a second ago, shoulder extension also works your lats. So when people say which one works your lats, there's your answer. Both of them. And that is why, because now you're learning your muscles and your joint actions. Aha, see? There is a method to the madness, all right? Had to throw that in there. But, in all seriousness, this is the stuff trainers should know, because, I got asked that the other day via text from a friend. It's like, well, with the pull-up and a chin-up, like, what's the difference? Well, underhand, overhand, but there is more to it than that. There is more to it, as I just described. All right? So we're working our way through the important muscle groups. Now let's talk about the deltoids. The deltoids, there are three: anterior deltoids, medial or lateral deltoids, and rear deltoids. The anterior deltoids are, as you might have guessed, on the front. They are responsible for shoulder flexion. That means raising your arm upward. The medial deltoids are responsible for what we call shoulder abduction. That means moving your arm from the side outward, all right? Like you would do if you're doing a side raise, a lateral raise. The posterior deltoids are also among the neglected muscles similar to the glute medius. They're responsible for horizontal shoulder abduction. Sound familiar? Sounds a lot like the pec, which does horizontal shoulder adduction. So this, you're still in the horizontal plane, you're bent over, belly button towards the floor, and you're moving your arm outward, which is abduction. Okay, abduction. We say abduction so it's easier to hear. All right, abduct means to take away, right? So abduction, you're moving your arm away from your body in the plane of being bent over, all right, in the horizontal plane. All right, so with these exercises, anterior deltoids, best exercise to train it is front raises. Best compound exercise to do, push-ups or chest press. For the lateral raise, side raise, the best primary exercise to do is side raises. Makes sense, right? The best compound exercise to do is overhead presses or chest press. The reverse flies or the rear delts, the best exercise to do is the reverse fly, as I just said a second ago. The best compound exercise to do, we get away from the presses and now we're talking the pulls, would be a row. So if you're worried, man, how do I get all this in? Well, remember, there's compound exercises. So if you're doing presses, you're already working your pecs, and now I just told you you're working your shoulders, your anterior and your medial delts. And if you're doing your pulls, like your rows or pull-ups, you're already working your posterior deltoids. Now, there are reasons to do the primaries with injury, but just understand that you don't have to do everything all the time. All right? Now let's move on to the old biceps. Everybody wants good-looking biceps, right? I mean, I don't really know anybody that doesn't. The biceps are on the anterior portion of the arm. They're between your elbow and your shoulder. And they have two functions. Elbow flexion, that means it brings your fist to your chest. And wrist supination, which means it turns your wrist outward, all right? So now the method to the madness tells you why supinating curls, meaning when you hold them at the side and you twist upward and in, and sometimes trainers say twist at the top, and you ask that trainer, celebrity trainer most of the time, why do you twist at the top? And they go, I don't know, because I do it. That's not the reason. You twist at the top because it's supination of the wrist, and then it makes sure that you're activating all of the bicep, all right? So I guess it's good they know to do it, but it'd be even better if they knew why, right? So that's the bicep has two functions with that. Best primary exercise is, as I just said, a supinating twisting curl. That's really the best primary you can do. Does that mean the other curls suck? No. Depends what you have, and it's good to have variety. Just know that, if you really want to train all the fibers of the biceps, bicep brachii to be specific, then you should supinate the wrist at the top. The best compound exercise to do are chin-ups or pull-downs. You're going to work your biceps too. So once again, if you don't have time to hit all these secondary muscle groups, so to say, like the biceps and the triceps and whatnot, then as you see, which is why I'm trying to teach you this, the compound exercises will cover them too. All right? Triceps. You guessed it. There are three heads to the tricep. The three-headed monster. And they get neglected a lot too, even though they're so much more functional than the bicep. So much more functional. But, you can't see them in the mirror, so why train them, right? Screw it, Yeah, right. Of course, that's not the mindset you should have, but many do. It's called the tricep because there are three heads. You have the long head, you have the lateral head, and you have the short head of the tricep. All right? Three heads. that share the same joint action, elbow extension. They also pronate the wrist, which only makes sense, right? So if the bicep and tricep are polar opposites of each other, they're going to have polar opposite functions, and they do. So the triceps extend the elbow and pronate, which means push the medial portion of your palm down inward, all right? The very best primary exercise to do for the tricep is a kickback or a press down or an overhead tricep. And here's something for you. It just comes up perfectly in this conversation. When you hear some trainers say, oh, you need to do, 3 different exercises for your tricep, 3 different primary exercises, press downs, kickbacks, and overhead tricep extensions, and maybe lying tricep extensions all at the same time, all in the same workout, because you have to hit them from different angles. Well, guess what? You're going to go, you know what? I listened to Rob on There's a Method to the Madness, and I know that's not true, because I do know that the triceps have 1 function, and 2 if you're including pronation, and that is to extend the elbow. So no matter how I extend the elbow, I'm working my triceps. So Mr. Trainer, you are wrong for telling me to do so many different angles, or that I have to. Is there anything wrong with doing different angles, like different workouts? Of course not. Just know you're training the same muscle just in a different way, which is great. I love to use variety, but now understand why. All right, and the best compound exercise to do for the tricep is, again, a bench press, a push-up, or any kind of chest press. So if you're rushed for time, or you feel like your triceps are already pretty damn good or whatever, and you've already done a lot of presses, you covered them. Don't worry about it. You don't worry. I mean, that's why we need knowledge. Knowledge is king. We get knowledge, we know what we should be doing. Now let's move into the core. I think I covered this a couple weeks ago, but I'll do it again. The anterior abdominals have 2 muscles, the transverse abdominis and the rectus abdominis. Transverse abdominis are deeper, and they're responsible for holding your spine in position. So we call them iso muscles. So iso meaning isometric. They're iso muscles. So their job is to hold you in place. That's all they do. That's what the transverse muscles do. Now, the best isolation or primary exercise for them is the plank, but it's not really. It's just like if I had it, if you had to say, what do people do to train it? That's it. The reality is the best way to train them is during every exercise you do, keep your spine up. If you're keeping your spine up and in proper posture on the squats, you never have to do a plank again. Sometimes people need to strengthen them by doing those first, but I would argue they just need to do their squats correctly, right? And there isn't a compound. That's just it right there. The transverse abdominals, keep your spine straight. And if you're always focusing on keeping your spine straight, you're training them when you strength train. Bing, bang, boom, got them done. Rectus abdominals, they actually flex the spine. Flexion means bring closer to you. So if you're raising off the ground in a sit-up position, that is flexion of the spine. The best iso exercise for that, isolation exercise for that, is a basic stomach crunch. I mean, that's the motion right there. Do the joint action. I will say that they're usually overworked, and I'll leave it at that. There is not a compound exercise for those muscles. Now, in my estimation, the 2 more important muscles of the anterior region of your abdominals is the internal and external obliques. There's 2 of them. One's deeper, the internal, than the other, the external. They are responsible for rotation of the spine, so when you twist, they do that, and they're responsible for spinal flexion, which means when you bend at the side. Very important, especially for rotators. When you run, if you want to conserve energy by not rotating your spine, strengthen them so they're stronger to keep you in place. The best way to do that is through like Russian twists or twist using the machine, but something that will rotate under load safely. You don't want to shear your spine and go too heavy by any means, but something where you're going to feel a burn in those obliques and that strengthening them. Compound, be aware of them. Do single arm or single leg exercises where your body basically has to be stabilized by those muscles. That's a great way to train your obliques. People call the love handles, right? There's nothing to do with them. Of course, it's the muscles underneath that we need to train, and if we want to get rid of the love handles, so to say, That's body fat, and that comes from the best exercise in the world, which are push-aways. Push away from that table. And now let's move on to the posterior portion of the spine, the spinal erectors. And the official muscle is called the erector spinae. It's connected just above your glutes, and sometimes when you have a backache, you feel it into your glutes, and that's why. It is responsible for spinal extension, so the exact opposite of what your rectus abdominals do, which is flex the spine. It's responsible for extending your spine. So if you're bent over and you stand up, not in a squat, but just straight up, that's spinal extension. Very important to train. It pisses me off that people won't train their spinal erectors. You have to train them. The number one correlation to back injuries is a weak back, not a weak, quote, core, unquote, drives me nuts, weak low back muscles, all right? Best isolation exercise, prone cobras on the floor, which I teach people. Hyperextensions, a little gizmo, looks like a Roman chair you get on backwards, or a low back machine. I mean, I don't have a lot of room in my gym, but I made sure that I bought a low back machine because training the low back muscles is so important. And finally, we're going to move on to the old gastrocs and soleus. There's actually two muscles in your lower legs that we like, posterior, that we like to call the calf muscles. They are the gastrocnemius and the soleus, so there are two. The gastroc is superficial, meaning close to the skin. The soleus is deep, meaning underneath the gastrocs. Now, both of them do plantar flexion. That means raise the heel off the ground. But the gastrocs are trained when we're standing or the legs are fully extended, and the soleus is trained when we're seated or bent knee. In my estimation, both should be trained. Now, we always tell our clients here that the soleus muscle is the second heart, which is true because it's deep in the calves. So if you're having circulation issues, sometimes that comes from the blood pooling down in the calves and not having strong enough calf muscles, strong enough muscles in general to pump the blood flow back to the heart. So when we strengthen those muscles, they actually do a better job of pushing blood back up. So we call the soleus the second heart. So even if you don't necessarily want bigger calf muscles or stronger calf muscles, it's good to train them for circulation reasons. Again, standing calf raises for the gastroc can be done with dumbbells or on a machine. The soleus can be trained by doing seated calf raises, which is pretty hard to do without a machine. All right. I said that was going to be it, but I do want to throw in, and there's no compound exercises for the calf. Anytime you're doing squats or whatever, you're forcing them to stabilize you. But other than that, you can only train them through an isolation exercise or exercises. But I would feel remiss if I didn't include the anterior tibialis on the front of the shin. Runners that don't train that, it's foolish, because when you don't train that, you get imbalances in your calf muscles, so the calves get too tight. When you're not training the antagonist, which is the anterior tibialis on the very front of your shin, it's the muscle there. And what happens when you get tight calves due to this imbalance is you start to get plantar fasciitis. So it's very important to actually work on that and always train the antagonist, the opposite of the muscles. Best way to do that is toe-ups, like with a band where you're pulling your toes to your nose type of thing, or there's a machine for it, but it is important to do. All right, so I hope this helps. I love talking about muscles. Make sure you memorize this one. Replay it, listen to it over and over. Because again, if you really learn this stuff, you're going to know what you're doing when you pick exercises, and you won't just randomly follow some Yahoo on Instagram doing a cool exercise. Who's got time for that? Let's get to what we need and do it. All right. Now let me thank my second sponsor we've picked up. Everybody out there knows I love vegetarian meals, I love salads, and let me tell you, Istanbul-Turkish Mediterranean Grill in Ormond Beach, they have them, and they're phenomenal. They're great. You really need to give them a shout if you haven't checked them out yet. They're at 4888 South Young Street, Ormond Beach, 386-492-7100, or they can be reached at istanbulflorida.com. Let me say their address over again because it's 488 South Young Street. Give them a shout. I'm telling you, they're good. Until next time, be max fit and be max well.